I get it. This is yet another different version of Real Business of Wine, because it's the first time we've actually done a really long distance one-on-one interview. We've got some guests, I think, coming along, but one-on-one interview from the UK to Bolivia. And you can tell me in a second whereabouts you are in Bolivia, but you have been in Bolivia since early January, I believe, or through January, making wine at a high altitude there, I think for the first time. And this is just another in a long list of the places where you've actually been making wine over the last, well, we'll find out how many years. So anyway, welcome to Real Business Wine. And
16 years.
Tell me a little bit about the background to where you are and what you're doing.
Right, where do I start? So it's a project called Jardín Oculto, which is Spanish for secret garden. And it was developed by a lady called Maria Jose Granier, who has been in the wine business for quite some time. And about 2 years ago, she was introduced to this very old vineyard in the Sinti Valley, which is 2 valleys along from where we are. It's about a 3-hour drive from here.
So whereabouts are we on a map? I'm going to see if I can get a map up while we're talking, but whereabouts are we? What's your nearest town or village or whatever?
I'm in a city called Tarija, which is in the south of the country. And we're at a latitude of about 22 degrees south.
But Torija is Torilla, is that right?
Arija.
Torija, okay. Okay, well, I'll find that while we're talking. So you've been there. And she's got this vineyard. How big's the vineyard?
It's about 6 hectares. It's not her vineyard. It's actually owned by a family, and it has been in the same family for, well, basically since it was planted, so at least 200 years. And so the oldest vines there are dating back about 200 years.
So, let's go back to how you came to be, because my understanding is that you were going to be a lawyer, and then you were a chef. And then you did various things, which I believe may have included the circus and so on. Let's go back to the beginning of really where you started. How did you get to be in the wine world in the first place? And your parents were Indian non-wine drinkers, is that correct?
Yes, my parents are Indian teetotalers, non-meat eaters. Both general practitioners, in fact, even though they're now retired.
And whereabouts was that? That was in the UK?
In the UK. I was born and brought up in the UK.
Whereabouts?
Near Manchester.
Right. And so from there, you've gone in to study law initially.
Yes.
And then it all goes wrong.
Yeah, well, I think I've always enjoyed pursuing different paths and looking, and I just find attractive things that interest me. So I tried many things in my life because I had the opportunity to be able to do that. I had the support from my family to try what suited me as opposed to a forced career path, which I was very, very so it did allow me to try my hand at cooking. That didn't work out for me, but I was working in a restaurant that was very keen on promoting the education of its staff, and part of that education was to put all the staff through the Wine and Spirits Education Trust courses.
This was the Ivy in London, is that right?
This was the Ivy, yeah.
And so, and from what I understood, that actually the problem there was potatoes.
Yes, I developed food allergies, predominantly to raw potatoes. It was something to do with the solanine content in the skin, and so when I was processing basically 40 kilos a day, it just knocked me out. and I ended up in hospital, unfortunately.
Right. And so then, but you'd already been interested in wine, so that meant that you ended up following that line.
Yeah, sort of. I don't think I was really that interested in wine, but I really enjoyed flavors, and if I couldn't do food, wine seemed like the sort of next logical transition, I suppose. So I had done the level, or basic as it was then, at the IB, and I put myself through the next two levels before trying to apply for work in the industry, and ended up as my first job joining John Armitt Wines as it was then.
And that was on a tech side, from my understanding.
It was sort of on tech marketing side. I was looking after the database of their customers and segmenting it and analyzing it.
And then how does that turn into winemaking?
Because the more I learned about wine, the more I tasted wine, the more I realized that if I had the skills to cook, I probably had the skills to be able to make wine. I could definitely see them being transferable. And I thought about it for a number of years. I didn't pursue it because it would involve leaving the UK, leaving my family, leaving what was comfortable, and also not a small expense. And then reached a certain stage where my parents could see that I really wanted to go and do something. And they sat me down and said, if you want to go study winemaking, go study winemaking. And so with their support, I ran away to Australia to study the undergraduate course there at Adelaide University.
Which was, so what year was that?
2002, I think. Yeah, 2002.
So one of the things that was always said about studying in Australia versus Davis in California and some of the other schools was that the Australian teaching was more practical than some of the American way of looking at it. Is that a fair view?
I think that's fair. I think Australia has or at least Adelaide has a very good balance between the practical aspects and the theoretical aspects. Davis was much more theoretical and science-based, but then if you looked at something like the course at Lincoln, that was even more practical-based. And I was always impressed by any graduates I met from Lincoln with their sort of innate ability that they had in a winery or a vineyard. They knew how to drive a tractor, fix things.
But when you learn, but I think one of the things you get at Adelaide, you get marketing as well as winemaking. Is that still correct? Was that part of it?
It's basic marketing, like you do basic business. You can do electives to further that, and it does have an excellent wine business and wine marketing program in its own right. So you do have access to the staff there, the other students, and also the library.
I guess the reason I'm saying that is that in terms of some of the conversations you and I have had in the past, you, compared to a lot of the other winemakers I know, whether traveling or consultant or whatever, have always seemed to have an interest in the way wine is marketed and packaged and sold, as well as the making of it. And those, I often find that those two sides of the wine industry are quite separate in some people's minds. I don't know how you see that.
Yeah, I think unfortunately they are. There's unfortunately not as much cross-fertilization between the two streams as there could be, but you could also say there's not as much cross-fertilization between winemaking and viticulture as well, for example. But they are all part of the same, they're all part of the same package, and I believe if you're going to be successful in this business, you need to have an understanding of all aspects of it. You don't need to be an expert in all aspects. You need to have an understanding of all of it.
And do you think that there is too much just sort of repairing what's already happened in the winery by winemakers without enough viticulture focus? Because you were, where you've arrived in Bolivia, presumably you didn't have very much say in the way those grapes were grown before you arrived there. Or did you?
No, none at all. And to be honest, especially with this project, I don't think I will have any say going forward either. But that's really due to the facts of how they are grown, because they are traditionally farmed. They are, as I said, 200-year-old vines that are grown-up trees that are planted at the same time vines were planted. So there's actually very little active viticulture you can actually do with them, unfortunately. Just have to accept what you're given and try to make the best possible.
We'll come back to Bolivia because it's quite nice subject, but from when you started as a winemaker, as a newly trained winemaker in Australia, there you were qualified with no vines or vineyard or anywhere to go. What was the first thing that happened? Well, what was the first job? How did you get to be producing wine somewhere?
Well, as part of the undergraduate course, you have to do a harvest, a 3-month practical experience. And I was very, very lucky that the place I managed to go to was Seven Hill Cellars in the Clare Valley. I've always been a massive fan of Riesling, and I've always wanted to make Riesling. But with Seven Hill Cellars, they also had 17 different grape varieties there. So I got to see a wide range of fruits, a wide range of wine styles as well. And as we were only a team of 3 people, I got to do everything, every aspect of the process as well. So it was right in the deep end for me.
I'm hoping that if I move across, is this where you are in Bolivia, do you think? Tarija?
Possibly.
Is that roughly? So if I can move across, I've got
it's just behind you.
Yep, I can actually move out of the way, out this way, and we can actually see it. Is that right?
Oh yeah, where the red dot is. That's Tarija.
Okay, that's fine. So, so you're now in the Clare Valley, and you've made. What was your favorite grape? What was the variety that really caught your attention?
For me, that year it was Gewürztraminer, because the head winemaker there didn't really want to make it. He said basically, "Here you go. This is for you to make, and you can make whatever you want with it. And because if you get it wrong, we'll just blend it anyway." So
and there wasn't that much Traminer in New Zealand at the time, was there? It's always a grape, I think it's done well there, but there wasn't that much of it around.
No, it's generally too hot. It gets the alcohol gets too high, the acid gets too low, basically. But it was my first opportunity to try something. I tried something that I thought would work, and it did work, and it won a bronze in the Clare Valley Wine Show.
That was your first wine, effectively.
That was my first wine, yes.
And so where did you move from there?
I think I stayed in Australia for another 2 harvests, one in McLaren Vale, then went back up to the Clare Valley. And then after that, did the usual sort of bounce around the globe that winemakers do when they are starting out, and ended up in Germany and Hungary and where else? Ukraine, maybe? Oh no, New Zealand.
So Germany, so the interesting thing is that there is this difference between the places where you get to get some involvement with the vineyard because you're in an ongoing relationship. The places where you actually arrive, as you did in Bolivia, and you can presumably have some choice of what gets picked and where and how, but not necessarily beyond that. And then Germany, from my understanding, you were dealing with essentially juice. Is that right?
That's right. I was working for Ray Kendam at the time, so I spent an entire vintage without actually seeing a grape at all. We just had 22,000 litre juice trucks that came in, and we used to unload them, clarify them, ferment them, and then send them back out again.
Which is not necessarily the most satisfying of jobs, but I guess it's a way of learning how to make wine at its most basic.
It is, and yes. See, I disagree that it's not satisfying, because you still have to create a good, clean product at the end of the day that will be fit for purpose. I mean, granted, these wines were going to be sold for €2 a bottle, probably, but that's fine. That's not a problem. It's actually probably more of a challenge to make a wine like that than it is to make I don't know, 2 barrels of some very, very high end bit of Burgundy.
So let's, where this is moving us, I think, is into that whole subject of the natural wine, the industrial wine, the concept of what wine is. And I think that there are people who really definitely would rather not think of wine, of what you were doing for Ray Kenderman, as being part of their vision of the ideal wine industry, or even if we can use that word industry. But you think there's no reason why, if we're trying to make a €2 wine, that's not an entirely legitimate way of doing it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's what that segment of the market is essentially what drives the industry, really. Without it, most of the industry wouldn't exist. Most of the supply chains wouldn't exist.
And then how does that work in terms of again, let's go back to the question of additives, use of equipment within the winery and so on. How relaxed do you feel about that? Because again, some people are a lot more negative than others on that.
So my personal preference is to use as few inputs as possible, no matter what the scale. So it will take more work to do that, because you'll have to essentially judge each batch that would come in on its individual merits and address any amelioration to that. There are a number of reasons for doing that, and it's not just a philosophical reason, but I like the idea that I can be as hands-off as possible. A lot of it has to do with the fact it makes financial sense to have as little input as possible, because every input you have will cost you money, and that will affect your margin. So
it's interesting. I remember talking to a Tesco buyer about a cheap Spanish wine that they had got, that they were selling in Tetra Pak. And I said to him, no, I thought it was a very well bought wine. And I said, and one of the things I liked about it was the fact that it hadn't been banged on the head with sugar. And he wryly said to me, sugar costs money. So actually putting a 12.5% basic Carignana, basic red, or from wherever it was, with no added sugar was actually cheaper than sweetening it up. And I thought it was actually an interesting point. But how natural, natural is probably too broad a word, but how low intervention can you make large quantities of wine, do you think? What are the interventions? I mean, in terms of not filtering, I imagine that you'd be nervous of not doing that, for example. What are the red lines, do you feel, as a flying winemaker or traveling winemaker, that you couldn't move away from?
It depends on what the end market for that product is. With the wines at Ray Kenderman, they had to be clean, free from faults, and stable. So they had to go through the process of finding stabilization and filtration. There was no other way that they would be accepted by the end user at all. With other, it also depends on how quick you want things to market. If you have the luxury of being able to wait a year, then potentially the wine can stabilize naturally as well. So that's one input that you wouldn't necessarily have to fine or potentially filter either. And
what about how low on sulfur have you gone?
How low on sulfur?
Or would you go?
Again, it depends on it depends. I'm trying to keep things to a maximum of 30 parts here in Bolivia, for example.
So that's so in terms of addition, you're talking about in terms of what you'd add.
In terms of addition, 30 parts added. Just because we want to try and be as natural as possible. I would, keeping with the philosophy of what we're trying to do here, I would love to be without sulfur at all, but the supply chain wouldn't let me do that because no cold chain here. The storage conditions are poor, for example.
And what sort of volumes are you making there?
Oh, here, about 8,000 bottles this year.
It's a really small, it's a tiny project for the amount of time you're spending there. That's interesting.
Yes, yeah, but I'm not just doing the winemaking as well. We are working together. It's a long-term project. We are working together to develop the marketing strategy, to develop the sales strategies, to develop our communications, which is one of the reasons I was hired, is because I don't just do winemaking, I do the other aspects of the business as well.
And what sort of grapes are you growing? I should have asked that.
So the grapes for this project are Muscatel de Alexandria, Negra Criollo, and a local variety called Viscekenia. All three were varieties that were planted by the Spanish missionaries as they came through here 300 years ago.
Now, going back of some of the other previous experiences, let's look at Ukraine. Was interesting because you were in Crimea, I think, before the Russians moved in. Am I correct?
That's right.
That? And I've seen some of the state of the vineyards of those days. It was a pretty mess. There was a lot of very bad viticulture and vineyards in pretty bad state at that time, from my recollection. Is that reasonable?
That is reasonable, though the company I was working with was Inkerman, who are still, I think, the biggest producer in Crimea. Their vineyards were in generally very good condition. The key problems that you have, especially around the Black Sea, is powdery mildew. And at least for that year, luckily, it wasn't that big an issue, but it had been in previous years. One of the problems is that they just don't have the money to put the proper inputs into the vineyard to combat disease, unfortunately. Lucky that.
But otherwise, I mean, not too bad a place to be and work. I mean, you're near Sebastopol, I think, as I recall.
That's right, yeah.
And Kazakhstan, though, was the hardship post.
Yes, indeed. Kazakhstan was very, very difficult. One of the aspects of being a flying winemaker is you tend to be isolated wherever you are. Some countries will have other vineyards and other winemakers around you. Kazakhstan, there was nothing like that. I was in a town of 5,000 people where people didn't even really speak Russian, and they spoke Kazakh, and I couldn't speak Kazakh. So I had quite a very isolated existence for 3-4 months, actually, it was in the end.
And food, apparently, I think your background as a cook meant that food wasn't a great plus in food in being in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, Kazakh food was unfortunately some of the worst I've had. But one of the things I have always made sure I do is that when I do these kind of jobs, I take a little rescue pack with me, which is a pack of Indian spices and such like. So I can then go, I can obviously make food for myself, but I also find it's very important to cook for the team that I'm working with. It's one way of sharing experience and giving back to them.
And they enjoy your spicy food. Do they enjoy your taste in wine? Yes,
I would hope so. I mean,
but have you had? I suppose my question really is: I've seen over the years I've known a lot of flying winemakers, and there've been occasions where the wine they've been making for the client, whoever the client was not necessarily what the winemakers themselves wanted to drink.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, the client is king. So you make what the client wants. So you find out what the brief is and you try and meet the brief. With Ukraine, it was actually quite interesting. We were a team of, we're a small team of international winemakers trying to introduce new world techniques into Crimean winemaking. So we actually had a challenge there. We split the grapes into two. One half was made by their team, one half was made by our team. And then when everything was done, the wines were stable, we came back, we tasted each other's wines, and their team hated our wines, our team hated their wines. But at the end of the day, the investors, which are the people who are more important, loved the wines that the New World team made. So,
and am I right in thinking that in Kazakhstan you were asked to actually match the president's favorite wine?
That's right.
It's a great story. I don't know how true this is, but it's a good anecdote.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So I'm not sure still how much I can say about that time. But I was working for a senior member of the government at that time, and essentially the wines were being made to keep on side of the president. And so the wines were named after his children, for example, and his favorite wine happened to be Chateau Petrus. So my basic brief is that they wanted to make a wine similar to Chateau Petrus.
Using what kind of grapes?
We had Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Rocolle.
Okay, so you had some of the ingredients-ish.
Some of the ingredients. And actually, the grapes themselves were actually very, very good. I mean, it was very good fruit. Not of the concentration and of the style of Petrus, but still, I mean, nothing to be embarrassed about by any means.
So Indian heritage, or your parents' Indian heritage, what about making wine in India?
I have never had the opportunity to make wine in India. I've never been tempted either. I'm not sure how welcome my input would be in India, unfortunately. India can be quite difficult for Indians who have not grown up there.
I've heard that from other people. So let's go through other places. Norway is on the list, and I find that one of the most surprising, or probably the most surprising places on your list.
So Norway's new. I'll step back a little bit. So I run a Facebook group called Traveling Winemakers, and we've been going since 2007, and we now nearly have, I think, 40,000 members. And the idea behind it is that we try and connect people who are looking for winemakers, young winemakers who are looking for jobs, and people who are looking for information on viticulture and winemaking, and we basically have this global network of job offers, job seekers, mentors, and people who are doing crazy things like making wine in Norway or making wine in Bhutan or Bolivia. Somebody posted last year in August that he was looking at making wine in Norway, and was there anybody who would help out? And I said yes. And so I flew out to help out.
So whereabouts in Norway?
Just south of, just a little bit south of Oslo, in a place, well, some of the vineyards are in a place called Flitvet, and the others are around Drammen.
And what sort of grapes can you grow up there?
It's hybrids and kiwis. So the varieties that we're using for the wines we were making last year are Solaris, Sigareta, and for the red, for Dornfelder. There's also a lot of vines that are planted under plastic as well, in greenhouses as well. So we're hoping this year to actually make some Pinot Noir. as red wine. We'll see how that goes.
So have you tasted Danish wines? Have you tasted many of those?
Yes, but not for a while.
I'd be interested to know how comparable the Norwegian efforts would be to those.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very similar to Danish wine and the Swedish offerings as well, to be quite honest.
So that brings us back to the UK, obviously. It's another area that you have been looking at.
Yes. Again, I haven't really worked in the UK at all.
But you know a bit about the wine. You've tasted a lot of the wines here, though, I think.
Tasted a few of the wines, yes, over the years. The UK was just never as exotic as I wanted it to be. And I was when I was sort of first starting out professionally, the UK was really focused around sparkling wine, and I've never been that enamored with making sparkling wines.
So you've been doing this for what? How many years now? How many years? 13 years?
16 years.
16 years.
Yeah.
Is this a sustainable activity? Can you see yourself doing it for another 10, 15 years I mean, because you can do 2 harvests a year. Obviously, you've got the northern and southern hemisphere. Do you see yourself carrying on at this level, finding new challenges and new places every year?
No, is the answer to that. I had tried to settle down in France and basically develop a small number of clients who I could help and develop their winemaking viticulture. But unfortunately, with Brexit, that completely went out of the window, because as of the fact when we leave the EU, I will have no right to work in the EU. So that's completely ruined my business.
Because you did work at Gowda, that was coincidence, the Gowda and Gowda, I'm presuming.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting place to work in.
Yeah. Well, I worked at Gowda because I know the team there, and they had somebody who dropped out from their cellar crew with 10 days before harvest, and so I offered to help them out.
So looking at the big picture now, after all the places, how many countries now have you made wine in? I'm trying to keep count, but how many?
God,
overall?
No idea. It's definitely double figures. I know that, and I do know I've made wine from 63 different varieties. That's one figure I do have.
So that's leading me to the question of, if you had now a magic wand and unlimited money and obviously maybe some people to help you do it, where would you go to make good wine? Because obviously you can make interesting wine in interesting places. The big question is how good you can make some of those wines. Where's your ideal combination of making really, certainly aspiring to great wine or really fine wine in different places? Where would you be going?
Oof, that's a question now.
In terms of nostalgia of places you've been to, I suppose, in a way. Yeah,
well, I mean, Australia very much is still a home away from home. I lived there for 6 years. It's where I cut my teeth. It's what I know, and I love the open aspects that they have there for creating products and marketing and pushing things forward. You know, so far I'm actually really enamored with Bolivia as well. I think there's a lot of potential here.
What's your altitude there?
The altitude here is 1,900 meters. Where our grapes are grown, it's 2,300 meters.
So what are the, I mean, I've had conversations with Laura Catena about altitude in Argentina. What do you see as the pluses of high altitude for you?
Sorry, I'm just going to cough. Excuse me.
No worries. I can actually. Yes, fine. Are you okay?
I'm fine. Yes.
Despite having shared an apartment with people who were worried about having got the. Yes.
Yes, that's why I'm in quarantine at the moment. My boss lives next door with her husband, and I see them through the gate every day to get my food. Right. Altitude, it's something I'm just learning about. So I will probably actually contact Laura to ask her more about her experience. I mean, without a doubt, sun intensity, UV intensity is a big factor here, and that has an impact on I presume it'll have an impact on the anthocyanin content, the structure of the tannins, the resveratrol content, which is a word I can still never pronounce properly, and also the brightness of the fruit flavors as well. We also, because of the continentality aspects of where we are inland, we are high altitude, we have a massive diurnal temperature variation during the growing, just 5 degrees during the day, which also has an impact on the fruit character that's coming through. I mean, also the other aspect that I'm really enjoying about Bolivia is that it is so young here, even though grapes have been grown here for 300 years, they were always traditionally made into either communion wine or Ingani, which is the local version of Pisco. And the commercial wine industry here is only 50 years old, if that. It's young. It's as young as New Zealand, essentially.
So when you arrive in a place, whether it's Kazakhstan or Ukraine, Crimea, or here, Bolivia, it's part of the experience. I mean, how many Bolivian wines had you tasted before you started to make wine in Bolivia?
I had never tasted Bolivian wine before I moved here. So that was I mean, the first few days are going to be spending time with the clients, talking, tasting, developing some kind of shared language, because communication between yourself and the client is key on basically making wines to the brief that you want to be given, you're going to be given. And then after that, taste as many wines.
So I'm going to let Lotte Carolina ask a question. Lotte Carolina's a good friend of mine, based in Germany at the moment, but from further east in Europe. Lotte, go ahead.
Hi there, you can hear me?
We can.
I can.
Perfect. Yeah, so basically I've written down my question. I was wondering like what your biggest challenges are in this country to produce a decent quality wine, and furthermore thinking about the marketing strategy, because you said like you're involved with not only the winemaking but also with the marketing concept. What you are afraid of, or what do you think will put stones in your like way going along?
It's a good question. So we are not in normal times at this moment with the global pandemic. So that in itself has thrown every spanner in the work at every stage we could possibly think of. So for us, at least this year, we're not working out of our own premises. We're working out of somebody else's premises. So we have to adapt to their timetable, their equipment, and their resources for our processing. So that is one compromise that we have had to make. But that's, I mean, with winemaking, you adapt to compromises. You accept that you will have to make them. Your end goal is not necessarily the one you started off with, but you will find one that is equally as good. It may be better, but hopefully it will never be worse. With the marketing and sales aspects, honestly, I can't tell you at this point in time how things are going to go. We had our ideals, but we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of months. We don't know if we're going to be able to sell anything in the next couple of months. Actually, at this point in time, I don't even know if I can bottle these wines because everything has to be imported from overseas. Our borders are shut. Our bottles are stuck somewhere between here and Chile. Yeah, we're at a bit of a loss at the moment, to be honest.
Thanks for that.
So,
Go.
do you think like this whole COVID-19 thing will make you pause the whole project for quite a while? Because I mean, with 8,000 bottles, it will rather be like hand sell only, right?
That's right. It will be, but the market in Bolivia is tiny, and the market for something like our product would be even smaller. It would maybe be like 30 outlets throughout the country, maybe 30, maybe 40 outlets throughout the country, and all of those will be suffering like everybody else, is that they wouldn't have had any sales at all of their existing stock for however months it would have been so far. So they'll be sitting on stock. They won't be buying anything new once things immediately open up. I don't know. I mean, we're lucky in the fact that we only have that number of bottles. It's not that many bottles. This was a year of proof of concept to see if we could make something interesting from the grape varieties that people would be interested in. Those people who have tried the wines that we have made really like them. They are nothing like anything else that's been produced in Bolivia. So they stand out. I'm hoping they will have the shelf life to last until the end of the year, and so when things open up, they'll be able to be sold.
Can I ask a question, which is a crucial one to me about consultants and flying winemakers? When we go back to the 1980s and we had the Australians and New Zealanders in particular going into Eastern Europe, all over the world, usually for British supermarkets or direct wines and so on, the criticism was made that they were actually making the same kind of wine wherever they went. They would use the same commercial yeasts to make the Sauvignon, whatever it was, taste as much like the Sauvignon that they'd made somewhere else. And the same criticism obviously is made in spades of Michel Rolland. Wherever Michel Rolland goes, he makes a Michel Rolland wine. Now, Rolland, I remember asking him this, and he said to me, that's not fair. He said, basically, when I work at Chateau Ozone, they know the kind of wine they want to make, and I help them make that wine. And if I'm working in the top vintage wineries in Tuscany, the same thing applies. He said, if I've got a millionaire or billionaire who's just bought a vineyard and wants to make 100-point Parker wine, then he doesn't really know what he wants. He knows that he's got a vague idea. Then yes, he may end up getting a kind of more, if you like, Parkerized style. But he said it depends entirely on the client. Is that your experience? Do you have clients who know exactly what they want and clients who just say, make me some wine?
My focus is different from my consultancy. So I don't necessarily go in and make the wine for the client. What I try to do is to help the clients make the wine themselves and to educate them, to teach them how to work with their vineyard and their winery and their grapes to create a wine that they want. My consultancy lifetime per client is really about 2 or 3 years as a rule. I don't make their wines, they make their wines, and I teach them, basically.
And how realistic or how unrealistic are some of their expectations?
Well, Petrus in Kazakhstan.
That was where I was coming from. How many others how many other examples like that have you had?
Generally not, because I am brutally honest with my clients. So much so that we don't go past the first meeting, because I say, no, there's no way you can do this, and there's no point in you hiring me, because neither of us will be able to achieve what we want to achieve here. And I've got no problems about doing that. It means I'm not very rich, but
you're in the wine business, so that's probably goes with the territory.
At least got an excuse, though.
And what is the things? And we're close to the end, and I really appreciate the time you're giving us. What are the worst things? What are the things you've got? The things that have gone wrongest, if you like. Disaster stories are always good.
I've not really had any proper disasters. I mean, there are always things that go wrong during harvest, like power going out, or running out of water for 3 days, or something like that. But there's never that's something that's been an extreme disaster. Touch wood.
And the best surprise, where in terms of the wines you've made and the grapes you've used, what are the surprises? What would you say? Wow, you arrived somewhere and it all looked pretty basic, and what's come out has been really a happy surprise.
That's a very good question. I really enjoyed working in Hungary, because I tasted. I mean, I'm of the age where I grew up with drinking Egri Bikova, bull's blood, and the grape varieties in Hungary had always intrigued me. So to actually work with those firsthand was wonderful. I mean, Cape Francois, I think, is a marvelous grape variety. But it also introduced me to a variety there called Kadaka, which is a native variety from that area, which I think still to this day should be the poster boy for Hungarian wines. It is such a wonderfully aromatic, sensuous variety. It's the kind of thing that the Hungarians should be proud of. I realise there are issues with growing it, but it's still such a great variety.
But that actually brings us back to slightly what Lotte was talking about, is that you go into a place like Hungary that wants to, I mean, with this battle between traditional, indigenous, autochthonous grapes and the international grapes, and what the market wants. And that very often is quite a struggle to decide whether you make what you want to make or want to drink, or what is traditional, or whether you're going to make what the market will buy. And wearing your marketing commercial hat, how much is that an issue when you're talking to clients or looking at the wines you're making?
Well, I can recommend to clients that they want to go down a certain route to be commercially successful, but they don't always take my advice. In Hungary, for example, they definitely didn't take my advice. They wanted to create a super premium wine, but in so doing, it would reduce the quality of essentially what was, until that point, their top tier level of wines. But so they went ahead and did it. And
they're stripping the eyes out of what was already the premium to make the better one, and then they ended up, and that didn't work.
Yeah, which is, I mean, but that happens from what I see. So at the end of the day, the client is the one who has the financial exposure. The client is the one who is paying my bills. So I may not be happy about it, and I will definitely say something about it. But if that's what the client wants, that's what the client gets. It's practical business, basically.
Well, we're very close to the end, and I think in terms of the time we've got, but Bolivia, obviously somewhere that's caught your imagination by the sound of it. And have you, I mean, presumably, obviously COVID-19's been around since most of the time you've been there, so presumably you haven't had the chance to travel very far to look at other vineyards. Is that right?
Unfortunately not, no. I've had access to the wines from, I think, two other wineries. There are 27 in this region, and I've only had a chance to try two other wineries. And apart from that, no, I've been quite stuck, which is a bit of a shame. But we have a program of tasting whenever the quarantine gets lifted.
Well, I look forward to tasting the Bolivian wine when you get back to the UK. If you can bring a bottle or two back with you, I'd be of the 8,000. Nayan, thank you again for watching yourself, and again for the time. I'm glad we did record it because of the problems that we might have had with connections. And in fact, mine was working better today than it has done. But thank you again. Has anybody got any other questions? I've obviously asked all the questions I could think of in the hour of the recording. But Stan, I think you were interested in Bolivia, I think.
Stan there?
Yes. Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Whereabouts? Where are you, Stan?
Right now in Moscow.
Okay.
So I also very interested in Bolivia because I recently read something Jancis Robinson put in Oxford Companion to Wine, but it is usually not enough just to read and not to communicate with the person. And it's very interesting because she mentioned some grape varieties like Muscat of Alexandria, you mentioned it, and very interesting training system using pepper tree. I even Google it and I'm very curious. So what do you think the grape variety will be for Bolivia? The signature grape, like some kind of Argentinian Malbec? Or it's too early to tell us this situation?
That's a good question, and it is a question that has been asked by a number of other producers. We don't know yet. People are on Tanna, but as I think already taken by Uruguay. So Bolivia needs to find something different. The ones that I have found that have been outstanding here, surprisingly, are things like Uni Blanc, usually distilled into making brandy, for example. The Tempranillo here has been amazing as well. And two of the grape varieties that I've been working with, which are Negra Criolla and Visjoqueña, I find some promise in those as well, but I would like to be able to make them again next year and see what else they can do. This year has been pressurized, to say the least, with the pandemic, and that has had quite an impact on what we have been able to do, both in the vineyard and in the winery, and has really impacted on a lot of decisions that we've had to make this year. You also asked on the messenger about the training system of the vines. So when the Spanish came through here about 300-400 years ago, they developed the system where they grew a native tree, they grew the vine next to it, and as they both grew, the tree would support the vine. So there are two trees that are used here. There's the Moye, which is the Peruvian pink peppercorn, which is mentioned in the Oxford Companion, and there's another one called Chañar, which again is used. And both of those trees have a secondary use as well. The Peruvian peppercorn can be used for pink peppers, and the Chañar you can make a kind of molasses out of. And we're actually looking at potentially trying to make some kind of vermouth or wine-based drink using the trees that are supporting the vines that we're making the wine from in the future.
I've got a question from Stan asked earlier as well, which I thought was a very good question. It's a two-part question in a sense. Stan, you could ask it if you like. It's the one about working without any experience. Have you got that?
Yeah, I'm really interested in
your early question. Yeah.
Okay, so when you work, for example, in your region, and there are no previous winemakers, and you have no experience at all. It's all brand new, and what will you do? For example, from my point of view, but I'm not a winemaker. I will pick some grapes. I'm just theoretically talking about it. I will pick some grapes I know. For example, I know how to handle Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon, and I will pick them and start trying to create something using them. So what is the winemaker point of view?
For me, it's almost the kind of crossover between my previous life as a chef and my current life as a winemaker. You taste the fruit, you do the analysis as well. You look at the numbers, and that'll give you some kind of clue. But you taste the fruit. You see the size of the berries. You see the juice to pulp ratio, and it gives you an idea of what it is that those berries can do. And then there's a certain leap of faith after that to try and create something. My brief in Bolivia was to try and make something that was different from anything else in the market. Basically, everything else here is pretty much standard with whites. It's pressed, settled, fermented, clarified, bottled. Reds is fermented, pressed, clarified, bottled, and that's it. So we went down a different road of trying to do things. We've played around with lees for the muscat, for example. Played around with higher fermentation temperatures because my client, my boss here, didn't want anything that was overly muscaty. And with the Negro Criollo, for example, we've done 50% whole bunch fermentation, which is something that people don't do here at all, just to try and, like I said, make something different. And we've achieved that. We have made, in my opinion, some very good wines that are absolutely nothing like what is already in the marketplace.
Stan actually also asked a question which I think is relevant to flying winemakers, which is local regulations, which when you arrive somewhere from outside, presumably there are different rules that you may well trip up on.
Absolutely. And one of those often is acidity, for example, additions of any kind. It's something that you need to make sure that you ideally are aware of beforehand and before you go in. With Bolivia, there are no regulations, there are no rules. There are guidelines that are followed by the individual wineries, and there's a sort of group agreement, for example, of maximum amount of other varieties you're allowed to blend to still be able to call it a single variety, for example. But there really aren't any rules here as such yet. But it's something we are looking at developing further on down the line.
Do we have any more questions from the attendees in the last few minutes? Andrew, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Whereabouts are you? So to Nayan?
In Tarragona in Spain.
Yep.
And just a bit of background, Andrew and I have known each other for quite a few years. We actually both come from, both went to school in Manchester, and we both studied together at Adelaide University. That's
right. Nayan, glad to see you surviving this one. It sounds particularly tough, and especially with that another dislocation yesterday. It's I'm amazed at your optimism and staying power and everything. Fantastic job. I got two questions for you. The first is, how much better or different do you think that the grapes would be in Bolivia if they were grown normally, like VSP or on trellises or something, compared to up the trees? That's question one.
Okay, so to answer question one, it is only the vines that we are working with that are grown-up trees. Modern viticulture is here in Bolivia. So all of the more recent plantings over the past 50 years, essentially, which is when modern viticultural winemaking started here, is what you and I would recognize as being normal trellising. But the project is trying to make these old plantings, and some of these plantings are over 200 years old, is to make these old plantings commercially viable for both the grower and for ourselves.
Right, very interesting. Okay, good one. My other question is about being a consultant. You touched on a lot of issues, which, I mean, I thought almost all your answers are pretty much what I would have given, to be honest, except, you know, slightly different experience, but the same result. What interests me is if you're a consultant and you are making wines that, as Robert's mentioned, you know, that you don't like or that you don't think you should do, but the client, you know, has some knowledge or knows what they want. And, you know, I mean, you can't just go in and, you know, say, we're going to do this. Obviously, the client's paying the bills. I mean, we all understand that bit. But if you make a series of wines which you are not 100% happy with yourself, what do you think, how do you think that affects your reputation?
Badly, really, without a doubt. So we would have to, I mean, it would be on a client-by-client basis. So if that were to happen, and I'm in a very fortunate position that that hasn't happened, you would have to discuss it with the client, and you would have to discuss how any information and how any presentation of that relationship will then be disseminated in the future.
Right. So the flip side of that is, let's say you're in that kind of relationship, and then one of your wines gets a gold or a platinum somewhere. Can you then kind of try and claim the credit, or what? How does it work?
No, because I don't at all. I try to make sure that I am in no way the face of the wines.
Right.
It's different with Jardín Oculto here, because I've basically moved from a consultant role into being part of the team now. So I now have a vested interest and ownership over what's happening here, and it's wonderful, actually. It's nice to move over to that side for me.
Great. Well, I hope it goes well. Thanks a lot for your time, and best of luck, mate. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Andrew. Has anybody else got? We're really very much over time, and I really appreciate Nayan being there with his arm in a sling. And are you still on elephantine painkillers, Nayan, or are you,
yes,
how are you?
Working very well.
Well, if we do anyone for a last question? If not, I would like to say a thank you again for you, Nayan, for everybody else who's come along. And this will be on YouTube, and there's a lot there that I think people will be chewing over in the future, because there are always going to be people going to new frontiers like you, where we're actually rediscovering. I love the idea of 200-year-old vineyards being given a fresh start by someone from across the world. So get well soon, and good to see you back here when travel is possible and when we get a chance to sit around over a glass of wine.